But you guys have been sitting for a while. You can dance a little. Good morning. Morning. Kurt Vonnegut, 60 years ago, wrote, "I love you crazy ones. You're the only ones who'll talk about all the really terrific changes going on. The only ones crazy enough to know that life is a space voyage, and not a short one, but one that will last for billions of years. You're the only ones with the guts enough to really care about the future, who really notice what machines do to us, what wars do to us, what cities do to us. The only ones to agonize over time and distance, over mysteries, and over the fact that right now, we are determining whether the next billion years or so are going to be heaven or hell." So Vonnegut's character here was writing a love letter to science fiction authors who, in other words, are engineers of civic imagination, those who can see possibilities and see different futures before the rest of us can. And they know, we know, that we are creating the future now, as we speak. Every decision we make, every downtown-specific plan we write, every public space that we activate, every building that we build now in the present will have reverberations and echoes for generations. So what type of future is that we're building? Is it one that, as Jacob spoke about so beautifully, takes into account our interdependence and recognizes our interconnectedness? Is it one that brings future generations into the decision-making table? Is it one that knows that the inseparability of human well-being from planetary well-being is so critical? So planetary urbanism is a responsibility. It's a call to frame our local actions through the lens of that interdependence and through intergenerational and interspecies responsibility. So apologies if you saw this title and thought I was going to talk about urbanizing Mars. I'm not interested in urbanizing or colonizing other planets because I love this one that we're on. And I want to see it thrive for generations. And I think this room of people in particular is so uniquely equipped to help make that happen. You're the ones that can design the systems and the structures and the infrastructures to help make that happen. So what I want to talk about is bringing a planetary lens to the work that we're doing at the urban level, at the city level, at the community level, at the neighborhood level, because the planetary forces of floods and fires and instability and war and rapid tech development are most acutely felt at the local level. And that's also where we have the capacity to build our collective civic imagination, our ability to dream. What is civic imagination? It's our capacity to see new possibilities, to see different routes to different futures, and to have a sense of agency that we can make those futures happen. And I don't think that this capacity should only exist within this room, within planners and designers and futurists. I think it's a necessary capacity that everyone deserves access to. Civic imagination is critical infrastructure, I think, for planetary urbanism. I've been so inspired just the last 24 hours hearing about how much the Civic development is taking into account future generations, hearing about what Ginger just talked about. And I think in many Western cultures, we don't give a lot of thought to who is coming after us or what is coming after us. One of my favorite teachers, Buddhist scholar and environmental activist and futurist Joanna Macy, wrote that our ancestors knew how to take future generations into consideration. They would work a whole lifetime on a cathedral that they would never live to see completed. But with our super short attention spans and short-term incentives built into political cycles, into quarterly reports, it's so rare that we think that far out. But someone is, right? Someone somewhere is thinking about and is making a future that might not include you and might not include the communities that you're serving. I know that you all are thinking long-term. That's why we're here, right? But I want to bring this conversation even further. How can we bring the capacity to imagine? How can we bring civic imagination into the communities that we serve and not just into our planning processes? So I'm a futurist, a professional futurist. I have been for the last 6 years, and an accidental futurist before that. And I work with my organization, the Civic Foresight Project, work with cities and elected officials and communities around the globe to help them rethink how they go about problem solving, to help them see an expanded view of what could be possible in the future, to really help them reimagine and reframe the challenges they're facing. But here's the problem that we keep running into, is that as a general rule, humans are not great about thinking long term. I see some heads nodding, so maybe you've had some trouble planning for your own future. We do it all the time, right? We think, we dream, we plan, we worry, but our brains and our tools and our timescales just weren't built to be able to comprehend long time frames. And so we come up short when we try to do significantly transformational long-term planning. And this is because our brains really keep us locked into the present. When we try to think about the future, when you try to conjure up an image of the future, generally speaking, you're using what you already know to build that future. You're using your memories, because that's what you've seen and that's what you've experienced. And so it's hard to think about expansively different futures, and it's even harder to plan for things that you haven't seen. Another thing that our brain does really well is lock us into normalcy bias, which means that we don't plan for and we don't react that quickly to things that have never happened before. I think COVID probably showed us why this is problematic, because just because something hasn't happened in our lifetimes doesn't mean it hasn't happened before and won't happen in the future. The timescales that we comprehend and that we act on are so different from ecological and geological and planetary timelines. But there is something we can do about it. That's what futures thinking is about. It's not about predicting the future at all, but it's about looking around at what and how things are changing so we have a better sense of how we can prepare and move into the futures that we want. I would imagine there's some of you who are like, imagination is fluff, it's child's play, there are way more important things to think about than imagining. And I get it, it feels irresponsible to think about, fantasize about your dream home when you are putting the flames out in the one that's burning down the one you live in. But I want to convince you that imagination is not actually just play, it's a critical part of how we prepare for the future so that we don't get caught off guard by it. So I want to start with a story of civic imagination happening in one of the most unlikely places where futures seem impossibly far away, in a refugee camp in Uganda. So a few years ago, I had the privilege of traveling to Nakivale Refugee Settlement. That's what's pictured here. It's one of the oldest refugee camps on the continent of Africa, and it's also one of the largest in the world. So there's 170,000 people who live there, which represents both recent refugees as well as generations of people who were born and raised there. I met and started working with Patrick, who's an amazing community builder, a brilliant artist, an architect, and a Congolese refugee. And he had come to the camp a few years prior after fleeing violence in the Congo and had quickly built a small, brightly colored community center out of mud bricks and out of bottle bricks, and he built a small stage and a computer center and a space for learning. And as I got to know him and his community, he explained to me that maybe 1% of the camp's population would be resettled elsewhere on another continent. The rest of them would live the rest of their lives there. And so they were living in this liminality, not wanting to be there. And he wanted to give them a sense of belonging and a sense of home and a different way of thinking about their future. So my colleagues and I worked with him and his community to envision a new city center in the camp, some actual urban planning in a place that had kind of sprung up haphazardly. And they wanted it to be anchored by an amphitheater. So we helped them secure resources, and they created and built this outdoor amphitheater, which quickly became a hub for talent shows and music programs and youth programs and a women's group and festivals to bring together all the different cultures and countries that were represented in the camp. And transforming this plot of land was a seed of civic imagination that showed other people they didn't have to accept the default of the story they were told of what life in the camp was going to be. And so it quickly started attracting other things like public art in a refugee camp, a composting toilet, a permaculture garden, a social enterprise training center, and sent a message that things don't have to be the way that they are, that they can be different, that you are allowed to dream something different. And there's a reason it started with the amphitheater, because the amphitheater is an example of social infrastructure, which some of us talked about yesterday, these plazas and parks and community centers where not only can we grow our civic imagination, but also we have an opportunity to build relationships, to rebuild trust, to meet our neighbors, because that is what is going to help us when these planetary forces come. The sociologist Eric Klinenberg talks a lot about social infrastructure and says that in times of disaster, when our hard infrastructure fails us, as it often does, it's our social infrastructure that will save us. And so this is what I mean about civic imagination as critical, as a key infrastructure for everyone, not just a luxury for planners. And I know that civic imagination is not a panacea for all of the challenges in the world. It's not gonna stop sea level rise or reforest the Amazon or stop a genocide. But it's gonna help people see other pathways out of what we're being given. It's gonna help challenge the default, the status quo, the norm. I wanna show you another example of what that looked like across the world in San Francisco in the early 2010s, when some of these planetary forces were showing up in the form of fractured trust and rising rents because of displacement. A group of us were able to convince a landlord to rent us this building for $1 a month. This was a steep discount from what it was on the market for, of $27,000 a month. And this building was in the middle of one of these neighborhoods that was experiencing a lot of social friction and tension and protests because of rapid gentrification and tech development. And we called this building Free Space, as well as the project that followed, and immediately invited the community in an act of civic imagination. We had artists paint the outside, paint the inside, and it attracted people by the thousands. And they showed up at the space and asked us, what is this? What's happening here? And we turned the question back to them and said, well, what do you want to see? What do you want this to be? An invitation to civic imagination. And so the story of Free Space is really the story of people who were changed by this invitation, those who quit their day jobs to be community-based artists, or those who worked with kids to design their own future superhero costumes. And in the community that was actually able to come together and have civil conversations about how the neighborhood was changing, about gentrification. So my question is, how are you as designers, as planners, how are you building in opportunities for civic imagination into what you're building? How are you bringing that forth in your communities? I'm gonna tell you one more story. Last year, I was invited to Bogota to help the city open their Escuela de Futuros, their futures school. This was organized by the Minister of Culture, who told me that his inspiration had come on a trip that he had taken with his son to Brazil, his 12-year-old son. And they went to a futures exhibit, and he said it was the first time that he'd ever heard his son talk optimistically about the future. And he said that so many people in Bogota, especially youth, couldn't imagine a future for themselves in the city because of high rates of poverty, because of resource scarcity, because of water rationing. And he wanted to give them a different way to think about themselves in Bogota in the future. And so but he knew he needed to give them some scaffolding. So he opened this school, and I had the privilege of traveling down there with 4 other futurists to help design curriculum and launch this program with the general public. It was held in, the launch of the school was held in the main public library, so another good use of that social infrastructure. So you can maybe imagine my surprise when I walked into the opening and the first speaker had a huge slide deck, and the first slide in big block letters said, "El futuro no existe." The future doesn't exist. So is this like an existential crisis for the school? Is this going to just be an uphill battle? But slowly over the course of the week, I worked with my group on taking deeply embedded cultural narratives and examining how they point our imaginations in one direction or another. And we slowly started to look at how those narratives, how the directions they'd pointed our imaginations in, informed policies and informed systems and informed outcomes that made it such that people couldn't see a future for themselves there. And we flipped each of these narratives to be a different story. What is it that we want to see? What's the default that we want to see? That's what this slide is showing, these kind of flipped narratives. And we also painted a mural together of what we thought a vision for the future could look like. So what are some of the cultural narratives that are embedded where you are that maybe inhibit planetary thinking, that inhibit intergenerational thinking? These are the narratives that we need to flip. This is what planetary urbanism can look like at a city scale, not master plans for 2100, but if you're gonna write those, I'd like to see them. But what does a daily practice of civic imagination look like in the way that we show up locally? And how do we build that capacity? Sometimes it's as small as throwing a block party. So earlier this year for my birthday, I threw a block party in downtown Oakland at a newly opened park that had been a surface parking lot. I called it Civic Love because Oakland's motto is love life, and I wanted to be distinctly Oakland. And we transformed the lot with music and with a bicycle that blows bubbles when you ride it, and face painting and cookies that my mom made. And I also tried to do this as simply as possible. No street closures, no alcohol, no vending, because I didn't want to deal with the health department. I didn't want to have to get street closure permits. I wanted to make it an easily replicable template, an example of civic imagination, so anyone could walk by and see and realize and say, oh, that's something I could do too. Planting the seeds of civic imagination. And I will admit, I have a slightly vulnerable confession that as I was planning this, and it was super fun, and it was a great success, but I had these moments of doubt of like, there is war. There are immigration raids happening in my community. There are rights that are being rolled back for my family members, for my friends. And I'm throwing a block party? But the idea of it was never meant to be just a block party. It was always meant to be a bridge to something bigger, a way of bringing civic imagination into our everyday life so that we have a different way of being in community, of being neighbors, of building our social resilience so that we are better equipped as communities to handle the planetary forces when they come crashing down at our doors. So I know that again, you all are thinking long term, and that's why we're here. And our role as city people, as urbanists, as designers, is not to create the future for other people, but it's to create the conditions in which other people's communities' imaginations can thrive. So my question for you is, how are you going to do that? How are you going to build civic imagination into the things and the cities and the developments that you're building? And I look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you.